RedLANO, Red Latinoamericana de Neuro-oncologías.
MAPs actually are part of neurosurgery, and in particular, stereotactic neurosurgery is all about MAPs. And the MAPs let us understand and know the brain and its pathology. And in the operating room, we bring those maps, and it's those maps that guide us. And those maps didn't guide us very well up until recent years, when computing technology made it possible to correlate those maps with the operating room. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I would first like to thank the organizers of this wonderful meeting for the opportunity to participate. Thank you. Everyone's familiar with studies showing the efficacy of volumetric resection. And I just show this one study from MD Anderson that everyone quotes, where the outcomes for the patient are clearly enhanced with improved extent of resection. But it wasn't always that way. If one goes back less than 20 years, the experience of what happened in the operating room and how it correlated with something like a post-operative MRI was actually not very good. In this particular study from Germany, if one asked the neurosurgeon, was there any residual tumor, 21% of the time they said yes. 71% of the time they said no residual tumor, but an MRI obtained shortly after surgery showed that the reality was exactly the opposite. By the late 1990s, however, when image guidance became available, it was possible to have correlation between what was executed in the operating room and a post-operative MRI that was close to 100%. And that has to do with the digitization of the operating room that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about stereotaxy. For the neurosurgeons here, this is old information. For the non-surgeons, hopefully it will be of some interest to understand what we do in the operating room. I'm going to talk about frameless stereotaxy or image guidance, because this is really essential to volumetric resection. And most importantly, and hopefully of interest to the neurosurgeons, will be what's happening today in the investigative arena for updating registration intraoperatively to have correct maps. Stereotaxy has been around clinically, or has been around for about 100 years. And the early stereotactic frame lets you pick a point in a map, an atlas, and within that stereotactic frame, in this case it would be the head of an animal, but in human experience it would be a human head. And there would be a coordinate address in that space, and you could co-register the three-dimensional space of an atlas with the three-dimensional space of a stereotactic frame, and that's the heart of stereotaxy. And for the next 50 years, there were many, hundreds of stereotactic frames designed using all kinds of coordinate systems, and they enabled you to co-register a CT scan or an MRI scan with the operating room. All of that changed, however, in the early part of my career with the introduction of the personal computer. And when computational resources became available and they became inexpensive, they were brought into the operating room. And this computer replaced the stereotactic frame for volumetric resection. It did that because it enabled you to compute the matrix transformations to go from one three-dimensional space, such as MR space, to OR space, to microscope space, to heads-up displays in the operating room, and to go back and forth between these spaces instantaneously. The earliest systems used what we called a digitizer to define a coordinate space in the operating room. Instead of a space like this for a stereotactic frame, the entire room was stereotactic space. And if you moved within that space, it was tracked, and the three-dimensional coordinates for where you were, your unique address, were known. And you could track the focal point of an operating microscope. If you then looked at a display, you'd see a cursor showing you where you are, GPS in the operating room. And this is standard equipment now in most operating rooms. If you put a beam splitter in the optical path of the operating microscope and you connected it to a cathode ray tube, you could have a heads-up display. And the heads-up display could show you the outline of a tumor. So the surgeon no longer had to say, well, I think it's over here. The surgeon could follow that contour to have a very accurate and precise surgical resection. Over the past several decades, a whole variety of digitizing technologies, moving from the stereotactic frame from the 19th century to sonic digitizers, articulated arms, optical digitizers, inertial systems, and electromagnetic digitizers. All have advantages and disadvantages. Of these, the optical digitizer in the bottom right is the most commonly used today. These systems enable us to co-register multi-modality databases, the MRI scans, functional MR, tractography. You can also incorporate EEG data, PET scans, SPECT scans, and all of that information is available to the surgeon to follow a map precisely. It even provides the infrastructure for other technologies, such as robotics, that are increasingly coming into our operating room to accomplish things more accurately than our hands can. There's a problem, though. All of these systems use information from MRI scans or CT scans that were obtained prior to entering the operating room. And over the course of an operation, the registration accuracy slowly degrades. As the brain may deform or shift, or as tissue is removed, that map becomes less and less accurate. Toward the end of a resection, it may no longer be accurate enough to perform the level of resection that we're trying to do. In this particular study, the mean accuracy had degraded by 10 millimeters by the end of the case. In an analogous study using ultrasound, internally, the degree of shift that was taking place was almost as great. The response in the neurosurgical community was what I call a brute force response, and that was to throw millions of dollars, $55 million in this example, to bring intraoperative MRI to accomplish the same task. And even today, operating rooms around the world are putting in installations like this, including Dartmouth, at enormous expense. But sometimes we're not being as smart about this as we should be. There may be strategies that let us accomplish the same thing in the operating room in a more cost-effective, efficient, user-friendly way. And that's what I'm going to talk about. One approach to this is called computational modeling. If you take an MRI scan, you can generate a three-dimensional mesh with 100,000 nodes in it. You can the brain is subject to the same physical laws of this world that everything else is, and you can predict how the brain would move, deform the mesh, and then in a reverse process of the initial one, generate a surgeon intuitively friendly MRI picture to navigate. Now you might say, well, okay, that's clever, but I wouldn't want my brain operated on by this computational model. Turns out this computational model can be more accurate than intraoperative MR because you can have data sources obtainable in the operating room that are far less expensive and less intrusive than intraoperative MRI to guide this deformation process. You can tell this system where an exact point is in the surgical field that you can see, like a vessel junction, and you can define it through a mechanism I'm going to talk about, and you can force the model to be exact to that point, so you can be submillimetrically accurate. You can also use ultrasound, and I'm going to talk about this optical system and an ultrasound system and how we're applying it to accomplish updated registration. The advantage of these systems also is that you can have data such as functional MRI or SPECT scans that are embedded in the original image that don't have to be reacquired during surgery. They can be deformed and they can be shifted along with the structural properties of that MRI and accompany that in an efficient way. What you have is a preoperative MRI like this, and during surgery, in the background, computational resources now run that continually change our MRI to match what's happening during surgery. Now, I'll talk first about ultrasound. Ultrasound has a poor signal-to-noise ratio compared to MRI scan. It doesn't look very pretty. And further, the planes of acquisition are oblique and not the Cartesian coordinates that we're used to. But it's very accurate. It's very inexpensive. It's very easy to acquire. You can do two-dimensional ultrasound here and acquire many, many planes to reconstruct the volume of the brain. Or today, you can use 3D ultrasound to acquire the same image in a second or two. We now have a volumetric image that's accurate for that point in time. On the left is fiducial registration as currently used with image guidance today. And if you look at the intraoperative ultrasound and the segmented cyst structure, you can see that there's a shift that's taken place of 4 or 5 millimeters. On the right is an updated image that is where the cyst wall is accurate. Similarly, on the left is fiducial registration. We're operating on that segmented white contour, but you can see in this instance it's inaccurate, close to a centimeter at the depth of surgical resection. On the right is an updated MRI that is now accurate. Furthermore, during surgery, this system can keep running so that information that to the eye is unimportant, that has nothing to do with the tumor, as illustrated in the upper right quadrant, those green and red lines, no longer line up. But this system, you can shift, you can deform. In fact, you can deform in a non-rigid transformation, not just shifting, but changing the shape to account for nonlinear deformation. So that the image remains accurate to the MRI. If you can do this, might it be possible to find that intraoperative MRI image within the original MRI data set without any fiducials or any stereotactic planning taking place when that MRI scan was obtained? That's often the case, and without this, we're forced to repeat an MRI scan with fiducials, but you may not need to. We asked the question, could you use ultrasound to do the initial registration? You had no plan to ever operate on this patient, but now intraoperatively, you can take the ultrasound, you can fit the MRI first by taking the boundary of the skull, getting a first approximation that you see in the second column under binary registration, and then using mutual information algorithms, which are abundant on the internet today and widely used in computational resourcing. You can then align the MRI scan with the MRI that you obtained during surgery. It currently takes us about 25 seconds to do this registration. It's too long. But when we did this just a few years ago, it took 20-some hours. And in a year or two, this will probably be taking place almost real time. If you say, well, how accurate, how smart is the system to find that MRI scan from an MRI that you obtained? These show the capture ranges where if you're within 2 centimeters and you're within 40 degrees of your acquisition, it can nail it. And how accurate? This was just a study showing that in our experience that this system of registration was as accurate as fiducial registration. There is an app that you can get for your iPhone that lets you use the camera on the iPhone to look at a sign in another language, like English. And while you move the iPhone in real time, it shows you the Spanish as if it were there. And we're using ultrasound to show us an MRI image. The second methodology I want to talk about is stereopsis. On the operating microscope here are 2 high-definition cameras generating a pair of images on the right. If you cross your eyes, for anyone who remembers doing that with stereoangiography, you'll see a 3-dimensional picture. We're not interested in that 3-dimensional picture, but we have machine algorithms to take that pair of image and generate stereotactic coordinates for every point in the operative field that you can see. And it happens automatically. You don't have to segment anything or point to it. It just runs. Furthermore, it does it 15 times a second. So we can calculate compliance or different features. For a stereotactician, this is a dream. Every point 15 times a second to the resolution of the pixel of that camera, which far exceeds the resolution of MRI scans or CT scans. How do we use this? Here we are looking at the surface of a patient who's having a brain tumor resected, and if you look in the bottom right corner, you can see the contours in yellow, green, red at different points in the resection of how that surface has changed. And that, in turn, can be further refined by, in this instance, if you see a blood vessel generated from a reformatting of MRI data on the left, during surgery you see the same vessel, and it looks pretty accurate. But on the left-hand image here, you can see that it's off by a couple of millimeters in the right-hand side of the picture. This system automatically reformats the MRI to account for the shift that accounts for that discrepancy. On the right, on the top is conventional image guidance system, and you can see in this instance, as we look at the surface of the brain, the cursor corresponding to the focal point of the operating microscope is no longer exactly on the surface of the brain. On the right is the system running. So you're updating MRI throughout the case. Furthermore, having done the surface, we can then do retraction. If we put a retractor in, we can track how the retractor moves and how that moves the brain so that you have an updated image in your image guidance system shown here. And the hardest task of all is the removal of tissue and to account for that in an updated image as shown on this slide. And again, none of this requires stopping the operative procedure. The surgeon's just operating the way he or she would, but the MRI database is upgrading. Lastly, we have just in the last month integrated this into a industry standard image guidance surgery platform, enabling the dissemination of this methodology widespread to the neurosurgical community. And this is the first case in which it's been used, just showing a conventional image guidance system, or in this case. In conclusion, co-registration of multimodality databases, the fundamental principle of stereotaxy, is what's responsible for our being able to do volumetric resection today. It is totally different than when I trained not that many years ago. The accelerating computational resources that have come into the operating room that have digitized the field in so many ways have only facilitated transformational stereotaxy. It is possible through strategies, two examples of which I've shown you today in intraoperative ultrasound and optical imaging. It's possible to use these easily acquired, inexpensive, non-cumbersome, efficient streams of spatial information to incorporate them through algorithms and computational resources to deform the preoperative map you had to one that is now current. And considering some of the alternative strategies, it would be foolish not to consider what can be done in this manner. These strategies have major implications for intraoperative imaging today. And I would just say, this is what I've described is nothing against an intraoperative MRI. We're putting intraoperative MRI in at Dartmouth. But when we determine the specifications that we want in an MRI, we're not looking for a diagnostic scanner. Our task in the OR is to understand how the original multimodality database may have changed during surgery. And it enables us to have a smarter acquisition, a less expensive acquisition, and a more easily updated system year by year by year. I'd like to acknowledge the work of my collaborators on this from the engineering school at Dartmouth, Keith Paulson, Alex Hartoff, Jael Fan, and Sangbai Ji. Thank you.
RedLANO, Red Latinoamericana de Neuro-Oncología.